Hi. So today we're going to be talking about what is structured input. So if you haven't already, take a look at the video before this that talks a little bit about the research and everything that we know about input processing, which is one of the theories that's been developed really heavily by Bill Van Patten in second language acquisition research. So today we're going to be looking at structured input, and in particular, we're looking at ways to teach grammatical forms in ways that are input oriented. So instead of the traditional, let's just learn it explicitly and then let's practice it and then let's use it, like this one's more building on the ideas of input. Okay. So to kind of give all the credit humanly possible to Bill Van Patten in this, and that's from his book, Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen. So this is called structured input, and it's a method of grammar teaching that guides readers to process what they read or hear. So input is extremely important as we're learning a second language. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use that really important principle of input, and we're going to use that as a way to kind of manipulate the system and help them acquire language and kind of guide them along the way. So our goal with this is to connect language forms and their meanings, all right? So I'm going to start us out with an example because I feel like if I talk about it first, it's not going to make a lot of sense, but if you see it first and then we talk about it, it kind of connects two and two together, okay? So if you don't speak Spanish, I'll just explain this out there. So this is what did Senor do yesterday? So this is saying Senor had a really, really weird day in comparison to his normal life. So decide whether each of these sentences is talking about something Senor did during a typical day or something that Senor did yesterday. The kind of catch with these sentences is that based on the sentence, some of them are really normal things to do, like driving to school, and some of them are really healthy things, like eating a salad or like walking or going to the gym, all things that I really don't do. So the healthy things are part of the weird day, and the normal things are part of the normal day. What's interesting as well is that I'm having them work on some tenses. So let me start out with this. So it's part of a familiar topic. It's part of a unit that we just talked about, like daily life. Okay. So I choose some sort of topic that relates to what we're doing. If it's completely random, it's not going to help them. But if it's related to what we're doing, that's the first step. So that's my sort of scenario. The next thing I have up here is I have a classifying activity. So if I think of those really, really good input activities where I'm like sorting or ranking or classifying, right? So here I'm having them check off whether it's part of a typical day or whether it's part of an abnormal day. Look at the beginning of each of these sentences. It starts with the verbs in front. I have one form only, which is really just the L and A, or the L form of the verb. And I'm focusing on one very, very particular part of language, which is the difference between L and A form in the present, L and A form in the past, okay? So look how I put senor at the top, and then I just put verbs all the way down the bottom. If I put senor in front of these verbs, that's the first word they're going to see, and that's not what I want, okay? I want them to actually notice what's going on in the front so that they can actually process what the verb endings are to help them build patterns, build mental representation of what's going on, okay? It's also just easier for them to see that way. But in order to complete this activity, you have to know what these verbs mean, okay? So that's that idea of meaning before form. So like I was saying, they have to know what the verbs mean in order to complete the activity. That's the super important part. Look at this difference. That's the same verb. One's in the past, one's in the present tense, okay? So this activity is really meaning-based. After they finish this, they're going to use the patterns from things above, and they're going to do a follow-up activity. Okay. This follow-up activity asks them not just to like classify and okay, you finished the activity. Now I want you to come up with three more. Use the patterns above. See if you can figure out three more things that I do on a normal basis, and three more things that I did maybe on that weird day. Okay. So this is a structured input activity, and this one works really, really well. Okay, so these, you can see kind of the setup, and this is how I set most of mine up, and I'll show you some more examples, but also show you some sort of creative ways to do it. But I always set it up with some sort of scenario at the top, some sort of input activity over here, the sentences I usually put over here, subject at the top, verbs all the way down, processing the meaning of those sentences, and then there's always some sort of extension activity that follows it. Okay. So this follows into the idea of this. So what we've seen before, and the way we've always kind of done traditional grammar, is that we give students the input and then we say, have at it. Okay. You're going to work on like in your head basically, and however long that takes. It could take you 5 minutes. It could take you 5 years. okay? But we're going to have you think about what you heard or what you read, and we're just going to have you develop that mental system that's going on in there. And then we'll get you to practice with it, and then we'll have you doing some output, okay? So that's the traditional way. Structured input is asking us to rethink the way we do that. Structured input is asking us to start with input. So like that activity I gave you with the sentences, those sentences are input, and I'm having them read or listen to them, right? But I'm helping them in that second stage. We used to just kind of let them have at it and figure it out. But now what we're doing is we're having them kind of develop that system, and we're going to manipulate that a little bit. We're going to help them along the way. So that's why I was having them do those classifying activities, so that I was having them attend to the input and see what was actually there and do something with it. And then from there, our goal is to help them to get to the output stage, and we'll see a difference because the input helped sort of influence that output. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for out of this. So like I said, it comes from BVP and it comes from his sort of guiding principles. So what he says in terms of setting up a structured input activity, he has 6 sort of things to keep in mind. The first thing is you're going to present one thing at a time. As language teachers, we kind of love to teach the whole chart. We love to teach all the forms of the verb because you never know when they're going to need to use every single form in one sentence. That's just not realistic. And that's not best practice in terms of helping them acquire language. Little chunks at a time is what's really going to help them. So if you think back to that activity I was doing before, my one thing I'm presenting is present versus past of one type of verb. Okay, it's very, very basic for that. I always want to make sure that I'm keeping the meaning of the sentences in as the focus, okay? So that's why all of those sentences, they had to understand what each one of those verbs meant in order to be able to do that activity. So the meaning comes first, the form comes later. Important that I'm never going to do one of these in isolation. I'm probably going to do a series of these over a couple of days, a couple of weeks, okay? So what I'm going to do is I think of the way that they process language in terms of the actual proficiency levels. So they start at novice where they do words, and then they move to phrases, then they move to short sentences and connected sentences and full paragraphs, right? So the same thing, I'm going to move from those sentences to connected discourse. So in the activity that I showed you, that activity was really just me having them do sentences. And then I'm going to build them up to doing connected sentences. And then I'm going to build them up even more to be able to do a whole paragraph and do that same sort of activity. It's really important to be able to do both oral and written input. So that means that the one I gave was written input. The next one might be them hearing those verb endings and hearing that input, so that I'm balancing those two input methods, right? Because I think that my personal way of doing it, I tend to do way more written input. And I think it's super important to keep this principle in mind, that you have to also do it in oral input, so that when they hear somebody say something in the past tense versus the present tense, they can build that representation in conversations, not just through reading it. Okay? Always have learners do something with the input. So never just have them sit there and look at the sentences, right? Have them look at the sentences and do some sort of activity with them. That's why they were classifying. And then always have some sort of follow-up activity with it as well. So it's never just check these things off and you did the input and you're fine. It's, okay, you did this, now let's do something more. Okay, let's build this up to some sort of maybe a task, something that we're doing with it, okay? And the last part is we're going to keep learners' processing strategies in mind. So there's 2 in particular that we really want to keep in mind. The first one is the way we write our sentences. So if you think back to the way I wrote those, I took out the subject, because what learners are going to do is they're going to look at the subject first, or the first word first, the last word second, and everything else in the middle just kind of gets jumbled up and not really attained to. So what I want to do is I want to manipulate that, so that the first word that they see is actually the verb, because that's the grammar that I want them to attend to, okay? The other learning process that I want to kind of keep in mind is time markers. So if I want them noticing the past tense, but every time I talk about the past tense, I put yesterday, they're not going to notice the endings on the verb. They're going to know it's past just by the word yesterday. So every single time I have to make sure that there's nothing kind of giving it away, so that they have to process the meaning of that verb. So let's look at some more examples, and I want to give credit to Greta Lundgaard because these are modified based on the examples that she presented at a conference at MathLab. Okay? So let's take a look at this. So your friend is complaining about their brother. Your friend says that they do so much around the house while the brother just causes problems. Read these statements, determine if your friend is talking about themselves or their brother. Okay? So that's a topic that is related to our current theme. We're talking about housing. Okay, so that works with there. Look at the verbs that I have here. I have yo forms of verbs. I have L and ea forms. So my very specific one thing that I'm focusing on is yo versus L and ea present tense. Okay. Notice the beginning are all verbs. They have to process the meaning of those verbs in order to be able to complete the sentence, or complete the activity, pardon. Students have to understand the verb and the sentence in order to do the activity. So that there it is. They're processing the meaning of the sentences, not processing the forms necessarily. Okay. I'm asking them to do something with this as well. They're classifying whether it's talking about their friend or whether they're talking about their brother. Okay. And at the end, I'm asking them to make their own personal story, their own sort of personal connection to it, and that's them doing something with the input. Okay? Think of you and someone else in your house. What are 3 things that you do around the house, and what are 3 things that somebody else does around the house? So it's kind of that same idea where up here, the person that's doing all the chores is the person that's in the yo form, and the person that's kind of causing the mess is the L and ea form. Okay? So what they're doing in this activity here is using the one above as sort of a model. Okay? And that's them interacting with the input as well as classifying. Let's look at a bad example here. So imagine that this is the structured input activity that I've created, and I say, read the following paragraph, and I want you to circle all of the verbs ending in ando or yendo. That's lovely. I can complete this activity without ever knowing what ando or yendo means. So first and foremost, there is nothing thematic or interesting about this at all. Like, you can find this person as interesting as you want, but there's nothing related to your actual curriculum. So right off the bat, there's no sort of scenario to make this any bit relevant to my life, right? And again, they don't have to know what ando or yendo means. I can just circle randomly, and I'm like, oh, that seems lovely. I did the activity. I should get an A for the day. But I'm not having to process what those verbs mean at all, okay? Circling is just all they're doing. They're not doing anything with those verbs. They're not ranking them in terms of or sequencing them in terms of when they happen, or ranking them in terms of this is the most important to the least important activity, right? There is literally nothing communicative about this activity. Using the word activity is also kind of might not even be the right word for it, okay? It's just circling. So now let's look at a good one. So in the recent article from the New York Times, talked about the lives of some famous singers, read the statements and from the article and choose whether they're talking about Dan and Shay or Kenny Chesney. So here's another interesting topic. It could be in a unit about pop culture. It could be in a unit about music, whatever you want to talk about there. I have a very, very specific target. I'm looking at singular verbs versus plural forms in the present tense, okay? So that is there. This has to be processed. And this is a very, very simple thing for them to look at. The first word that they see is the verb. And that's how they're going to be able to figure out if it's Dan and Shay, which is plural, or Kenny Chesney, which is singular. The students are making meaning of all of those sentences, so they have to understand what each one of these sentences mean in order to determine which one goes with which person. The only thing that's missing from this is an extension activity, right? So I had them attending to the input up here, but I don't have them doing anything with the input. So a proper activity afterwards could be for you to, if they're at the intermediate high level, maybe I want to sequence what is a typical day like for them. If they're at maybe the novice high level, I want them to come up with a few more simple sentences that match these ones up here to talk about these 2 people. Here's another poor example. So it says, read the statement about the future and decide whether it's probable or improbable for the year 3000. I mean, it's a good scenario. It really could be. It has potential. But I don't have a specific grammar point, right? I have all sorts of subjects going on. I have we, I have they, I have the president. And then I look at the different forms of it. Will be, am going. That's a lot to attend to, and that's not really what I want to have going on there. The subjects are also the first word in every single sentence. So remember, they're going to focus on we and then hoverboards. I and home, okay? Then they're going to focus on everything else in the middle, and it's going to get kind of jumbled up. I want that first part to be what they process. So there should be a verb in front of that. There's no extension activity, and it's really simple to come up with an extension activity for this, and I feel like this would be a really great activity to do, but at the same time, it's not really helping them process language. So how we're using structured input, we're going to choose a grammar point like a verb tense or some sort of agreement. We're going to create a scenario for learners where they need to process the language or the grammar. They need to understand what it means, the meaning before form. I'm going to write some simple sentences that are using the grammar, and that in those I'm going to avoid using subjects before my sentences. I'm going to avoid using time markers. I'm going to have students show their understanding of the sentence with some sort of input activity, such as selecting the appropriate category or classifying or ranking. And then after that, I'm going to have students use the model language for your own sentences to create your own. Okay.